December 7th, 1941. The morning sun climbed over the Hawaiian Islands, casting long shadows across the anchorage at Pearl Harbor. In the basement of the old administration building, a young radio intercept operator hunched over his equipment, headphones pressed tight against his ears, transcribing strings of 5-digit numbers that poured through the static. His pencil moved mechanically across the pad, capturing each group 1, 2, 8, 4, 7, 0, 9, 3, 5, 6, 7, 4, 6, 2, 1. He had no idea what these numbers meant. He didn't need to. His job was simply to copy every Japanese naval transmission he could intercept, every 5-digit group, every seemingly random sequence that filled the airwaves across the Pacific. 3 floors above him, the Pacific Fleet rested at anchor. Battleships lined Battleship Row in neat formation. The USS Arizona sat peacefully, her crew preparing for a quiet Sunday morning. The USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, the USS California, 8 battleships in total, representing American naval power in the Pacific. Sailors ate breakfast, officers reviewed paperwork, Marines stood watch. None of them knew that in less than 2 hours, peace would shatter forever. The radio operator kept copying. The numbers kept coming. Somewhere in those endless streams of 5-digit groups lay secrets that might have prevented the catastrophe about to unfold. But the code was unbreakable. Everyone said so. The Japanese naval code, designated JN-25 by American cryptanalysts, used approximately 33,000 possible code groups, each representing a word or phrase. Then the Japanese added another layer of encryption, super-enciphering each code group with random additives that changed regularly. It was a system so complex, so mathematically sophisticated, that full penetration seemed impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American codebreakers had been attacking JN-25 since June of 1939, more than 2 years of painstaking work. By late 1941, they had recovered perhaps 10 to 15% of the code groups, enough to provide fragments of intelligence, enough to know that something was being planned, but not enough to predict where or when. And then, just 3 days before Pearl Harbor, on December 4th, 1941, the Japanese changed their additive tables. The cryptanalysts called it additive number 8. Every technique they had developed for stripping away the encryption layer suddenly stopped working. They would need weeks to recover the new additives, weeks to rebuild their ability to read even fragments of Japanese messages. At 7:55 that morning, the first wave struck. 353 Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves. The attack had been planned with meticulous precision by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who understood both Japan's temporary advantage and America's long-term industrial superiority. Within 2 hours, 8 battleships lay sunk or damaged. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that over 1,100 men died in seconds, entombed forever in their ship. A 1,800-pound armor-piercing bomb had penetrated the forward magazine, triggering an explosion so massive it lifted the 30,000-ton warship out of the water. The USS Oklahoma rolled over after torpedo hits opened massive holes in her port side, trapping 429 sailors and Marines inside her hull. Some survived in air pockets for days, their desperate hammering on the hull audible to rescue workers who couldn't reach them in time. Over 180 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans dead. Another 1,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield against Japanese expansion, lay shattered. In that basement room, the radio operator kept copying. The Japanese transmissions continued. Victory messages, damage assessments, orders for the returning strike force. All of it encrypted in JN-25. All of it incomprehensible. The numbers that might have warned of the attack remained locked behind mathematics that seemed unbreakable. But in that basement, among the wreckage of America's Pacific strategy, A transformation was about to begin. The attack on Pearl Harbor would become the catalyst for the most important intelligence breakthrough in American military history. The man who would lead that breakthrough was Commander Joseph John Rochefort. Born in Dayton, Ohio on May 12, 1900, he had enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17. When joining, he claimed his birth year as 1898 to appear older and more eligible for advancement, a falsification that would persist in his service records throughout his career. He was commissioned as an ensign after graduating from the Navy's Steam Engineering School at Stevens Institute of Technology on June 14, 1919. His early career suggested nothing special, just another young officer working his way through the ranks. But a fellow officer noticed something others had missed. Rochefort had a talent for solving crossword puzzles. He was excellent at auction bridge, an advanced card game requiring pattern recognition, memory, and logical deduction. These weren't trivial skills. They indicated a mind that could find patterns in complexity, that could make logical inferences from incomplete information. The officer recommended Rochefort for the Navy's cryptanalysis program. In the early 1920s, naval cryptanalysis consisted of perhaps a dozen people working in cramped offices, barely funded, barely understood, trying to read the communications of potential adversaries. Rochefort proved to be a natural. In the mid-1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of language and cultural study. From 1929 to 1932, Rochefort lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese at the Navy's language school, and immersed himself in Japanese culture. He didn't just learn the language. He learned how Japanese people thought, how they communicated, how their military culture shaped their decision-making. He understood Japanese concepts of honor, duty, and hierarchical communication. It was during this assignment that Rochefort met another young officer, Edwin Layton, who would later become Admiral Chester Nimitz's intelligence officer. The two men formed a friendship based on their shared fascination with Japan and their conviction that understanding the enemy's language and culture would be essential in any future conflict. This cultural knowledge, combined with his cryptanalytic training, made Rochefort uniquely qualified to lead Station Hypo when war came. Station Hypo. The name came from the phonetic alphabet, designation for the letter H, standing for HIA, Hawaii, where one of the radio intercept towers was located. The unit's official designation was Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, but everyone called it Station Hypo. It was housed in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, a windowless concrete room 60 feet long, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the heat generated by IBM tabulating machines and the bodies of dozens of analysts working around the clock. This was where Joseph Rochefort would wage his war, not with guns or bombs, but with mathematics, linguistics, and relentless determination. Rochefort arrived to take command of Station Hypo in June of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. He inherited an impossible task. The unit had been tracking Japanese communications for years, but with limited success. Before Pearl Harbor, they could read perhaps 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, and most of those only partially. It was enough to provide some intelligence value, but nowhere near enough to predict major operations. The main Japanese operational code, JN25, consisted of approximately 30,000 to 33,000 5-digit number groups in actual use, each representing a word or phrase. The system was ingenious in its complexity. Each 5-digit group from the codebook represented a specific word, phrase, or concept. To make decryption even more difficult, the Japanese super-enciphered these code groups using additive tables. Essentially, they encrypted the messages twice. First, the message was encoded using the codebook. Then, random 5-digit numbers from separate additive books were added to each code group using non-carrying addition. The result was a message that appeared to be random numbers, resistant to frequency analysis and pattern recognition. Breaking this system required stripping off the additive layer through mathematical analysis, then determining the meaning of each 5-digit code group through painstaking analysis of usage patterns across thousands of intercepted messages. The cryptanalysts had to identify which additive table had been used for each message, subtract those additives to reveal the original code groups, then figure out what each code group meant, and the Japanese changed both the codebooks and the additive tables regularly, forcing the cryptanalysts to start over repeatedly. The additive system used books containing 300 pages, each page listing 100 random 5-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, the sender would start at a specified page and line, adding each successive additive to the corresponding code group. The receiver, knowing the starting point, could subtract the same additives to retrieve the original code groups. For American cryptanalysts, identifying which additive book and which starting point had been used was the first challenge. Sometimes they could determine this through radio call signs or message indicators. Other times they had to test hundreds of possibilities. On December 1st, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had changed to a new version of JN-25, designated JN-25B by American analysts. The new version used a different codebook and new additive tables, forcing the cryptanalysts to start over from nothing. Every code group they had painstakingly identified became useless overnight. Every additive recovery technique they had developed might no longer work. They were back at the beginning, staring at streams of 5-digit numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Rochefort had known an attack was coming somewhere. Traffic analysis, the study of communication patterns without reading the actual messages, had shown increased Japanese naval activity. Radio call signs were changing more frequently. Message volume was spiking. Ships were moving. Something big was happening. But the Japanese strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor had maintained perfect radio silence during their voyage from Japan. The 6 carriers and their escorts had transmitted nothing. You cannot track ships that emit no signals. The Pearl Harbor Task Force had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26th, taking a northern route across the Pacific, where they were unlikely to encounter merchant ships or patrol aircraft. For 11 days, they maintained absolute communications discipline, not a single radio transmission that could reveal their location or intentions. It was the most profound intelligence failure in American history. Rochefort understood that dwelling on failure would guarantee more disasters. The only path forward was through the enemy's communications. If Station Hypo could break JN-25B, could read enough Japanese messages to understand their plans, perhaps Pearl Harbor need not be repeated. Perhaps intelligence could provide Admiral Nimitz with the one weapon that might offset Japan's current superiority: foreknowledge of enemy intentions. His deputy and chief cryptanalyst was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a Naval Academy graduate who had trained under Agnes Driscoll, the legendary cryptanalyst who had pioneered the use of IBM punch card machines for code breaking. Driscoll, known throughout the cryptanalytic community as Miss Aggie, had been breaking codes since World War I. She had trained many of the Navy's best cryptanalysts and had made crucial breakthroughs against Japanese naval codes in the 1920s and 1930s. Her insight that IBM tabulating machines could be adapted for cryptanalysis had revolutionized the field. Dyer had been stationed at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. He possessed an encyclopedic memory for code groups and an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in seemingly random numbers. He could look at a partially decoded message and intuit what the missing code groups might represent based on context and usage patterns from other messages. The linguistics section was led by Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who had studied Japanese for 3 years in Tokyo as part of the same exchange program that had trained Rochefort. He worked with 5 other linguists who represented the Navy's best Japanese language specialists. Their job was to translate the portions of messages that the cryptanalysts could decrypt, then work with intelligence analysts to determine what the messages meant in the larger context of Japanese naval operations. The traffic analysis section, led by Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckins and John Williams, focused on message externals rather than content. They tracked which stations were communicating with each other, monitored the volume of traffic between units, analyzed priority designations, and mapped the patterns of communication that might reveal operational plans, even when the messages themselves remained encrypted. Rochefort fostered an environment where junior officers could question senior officers if the analysis demanded it, where credit for breakthroughs went to the team rather than individuals. As Rochefort often said, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." This philosophy was revolutionary in a military context, where hierarchy and credit for success were usually paramount. But Rochefort understood that breaking JN-25 required collaboration, cross-pollination of ideas, and the willingness to challenge assumptions regardless of who had made them. The cryptanalysis section was indeed a strange place by military standards. Officers worked in bathrobes and slippers when the heat became unbearable in the basement facility. The IBM machines generated tremendous heat, and the basement's inadequate ventilation made proper uniforms impractical during marathon work sessions. Formal or military discipline evaporated in favor of results. Rank mattered less than analytical skill. A junior enlisted radio man might notice a pattern that a senior officer had missed. A linguist might provide context that helped cryptanalysts understand the meaning of a partially decoded message. Everyone's insights mattered. The work was painfully slow and frustrating. Each intercepted message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups captured by radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific. Radio men at stations in Hawaii, Australia, and other locations listened to Japanese naval frequencies 24 hours a day, transcribing every message they heard. These messages were forwarded to Station Hypo for analysis. First, the cryptanalysts had to strip off the additive encryption using mathematical analysis. The Japanese used additive tables, where they added another 5-digit number to each code group using non-carrying addition. This meant that if a code group was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the additive was 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, the encrypted result was 7, 9, 1, 3, 5, adding each digit separately without carrying to the next position. Decryption required identifying which additive table had been used for each message, then subtracting the additive to reveal the original code group. This process alone could take hours for a single message. The cryptanalysts maintained massive files of recovered additives, organized by date and radio circuit, trying to identify patterns in how the Japanese used their additive tables. Once they had the original code groups, the real work began. The cryptanalysts maintained massive card catalogues representing years of accumulated knowledge about what each 5-digit number might mean. They made educated guesses based on context, comparing how specific code groups appeared in different messages, building slowly towards certainty. A code group that appeared frequently in messages between carriers might mean aircraft, aviation gasoline, or flight operations. One that appeared in logistics messages might mean fuel, supplies, or ammunition. The IBM punch card machines helped them search through thousands of messages to find patterns, comparing usage contexts, identifying code groups that appeared together frequently, building networks of meaning. But the actual analysis required human intelligence, intuition, and often brilliant guesses. The machines could sort and search, but only human analysts could interpret the results, make intuitive leaps, and recognize meaningful patterns in the chaos of partially decoded messages. It was detective work of the highest order, requiring mathematical precision, linguistic knowledge, cultural understanding, and creative thinking. By late December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Stationcast in the Philippines made the first progress on the new additive system. They shared their findings with Hypo and with the codebreakers in Washington. The cooperation between stations would prove essential, though it would later cause bitter bureaucratic conflicts. By January 1942, Rochefort's team was reading parts of JN-25B. Not complete messages, perhaps one word in 5, but it was enough to begin understanding Japanese intentions. They learned that the Japanese were planning operations in the South Pacific. In February, they detected preparations for an attack on Port Moresby in New Guinea. In March and April, as Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, the codebreakers tracked their movements, providing Nimitz with intelligence that allowed him to position his forces for maximum effect. During the intense period leading up to Midway, Dyer often worked extended shifts with the help of benzodrine tablets to maintain alertness. The amphetamines were standard issue for personnel working critical assignments that required staying awake for extended periods. I figured there were people out there getting shot at, Dyer later explained in oral history interviews. If it should happen that it turned out to inflict some injury on my health in the long run, so what? The work was exhausting. Rochefort and Dyer alternated 24-hour duty watches that often extended to 36 or even 48 hours straight. The basement room became their universe. They ate there, slept on cots there, worked there until their minds were numb. When they did manage to sleep, they often dreamed in 5-digit number groups. The IBM machines clattered constantly, sorting punch cards, looking for patterns. The machines could process in hours what would take humans weeks, but the machines could only find patterns. Human intelligence was still required to interpret them, to make the intuitive leaps that separated useful intelligence from noise. By April 1942, Station Hypo was reading approximately 20% of JN-25B messages. This was remarkable progress, achieved in just 4 months. More importantly, they were reading the right 20%. They had identified code groups for ship names, for locations, for military units, for common phrases used in operational planning. When a message came in discussing an upcoming operation, they could often determine what, where, and approximately when, even if large portions of the message remained unreadable. They had contributed intelligence to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, helping the US Navy locate Japanese carriers and achieve a tactical draw that halted Japan's advance toward Australia. Coral Sea was significant for multiple reasons. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other, all combat conducted by aircraft. It demonstrated that American carriers and pilots could fight effectively against the experienced Japanese carrier forces. And it damaged 2 Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, keeping them out of action for the next major operation. Then in mid-May, they began intercepting messages about a massive operation. The traffic volume increased dramatically. Messages flew between the combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine squadrons, battleship divisions, and invasion forces. All pointed to a major offensive scheduled for early June. Japanese operational security was good, but they had to communicate to coordinate a complex operation involving dozens of ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Each message, even if only partially readable, provided another piece of the puzzle. The target was designated AF in the Japanese location code system. Station Hypo believed AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, that housed a small but strategically important American airbase. Midway consisted of 2 small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by a coral reef. The atoll measured just over 2 miles across, but its location made it crucial. If Japan captured Midway, they would threaten Hawaii itself and possess a base from which to interdict American communications across the Central Pacific. More importantly, a Japanese operation against Midway would force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto desperately wanted to destroy those carriers. He knew that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's once American shipyards began producing carriers in quantity. Japan needed to win the war in 1942 while they still held numerical and operational superiority. But in Washington, the Navy's main cryptanalysis center, designated OP-20G, disagreed with Station Hypo's assessment. OP-20G, located in the Navy Department building in Washington, was ostensibly the superior organization. They had more personnel, better equipment, and the advantage of being located at the seat of naval power. But they lacked Station Hypo's specialized, focus on the Pacific Theater and Rochefort's team's cumulative experience with Japanese naval communications. The Washington analysts believed AF might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Some thought it could be a renewed offensive in the South Pacific toward Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa. Others feared an attack on Hawaii itself, or even the American West Coast. Without certainty about the target, Admiral Nimitz couldn't position his forces effectively. If he concentrated his carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. The disagreement intensified through late May. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet in Washington, trusted his staff in Washington more than this informal arrangement in Hawaii. King was a brilliant but difficult man, known for his abrasive personality and his insistence on proper procedure. He disliked Rochefort intensely, viewing him as insubordinate and overly confident. The disagreement wasn't just about bureaucratic territory. Lives hung in the balance. If Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. With only 3 carriers against Japan's carrier fleet, America couldn't afford to be wrong even once. The Pacific Fleet couldn't sustain another Pearl Harbor-level disaster. Everything depended on determining what AF meant. It was Captain Wilfred J. Holmes, one of Station Hypo's staff members, who conceived the brilliant idea that would settle the question. Holmes was a submariner by training who had been assigned to intelligence work. He had the practical mindset of an operational officer combined with an analytical mind. He suggested that Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and the base was running short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then reported that AF was short of water, Station Hypo would have definitive proof that AF meant Midway. It was a simple ruse, almost too simple to work, but simplicity was its strength. The Japanese were intercepting American communications just as the Americans were reading Japanese messages. If they overheard an unencrypted emergency message about water shortages at Midway, they would have no reason to suspect it was false. Rochefort immediately recognized the brilliance of Holmes's idea and brought it to Edwin Layton, who presented it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz was the kind of commander willing to trust his intelligence officers and take calculated risks. He approved the plan immediately. The garrison commander at Midway received instructions via secure submarine cable, a communications method the Japanese couldn't intercept, to transmit an emergency request for water supplies in plain language that anyone monitoring radio frequencies could intercept. Around May 19th to 21st, 1942, Midway sent the message. The transmission went out in clear, unencrypted language, reporting equipment problems and requesting emergency water supplies from Pearl Harbor. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. The message, sent in JN-25 and partially decrypted by Rochefort's team, stated that AF was experiencing water shortages. The proof was irrefutable. AF meant Midway. The Japanese were coming. But Washington remained skeptical. OP-20G insisted the attack would come in mid-June, while Station Hypo predicted late May or early June based on date indicators in the messages. The date-time groups in Japanese messages were super-enciphered beyond the standard JN-25 encryption, making them particularly difficult to decrypt. OP-20G hadn't broken the date-time encryption. Station Hypo had, thanks to a breakthrough by Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan. Finnegan, working under Dyer's supervision, discovered the method the Japanese used to encrypt their date-time groups. It was a separate system layered on top of JN-25, requiring additional mathematical analysis. Edwin Layton, in his memoir And I Was There, specifically credited Finnegan with discovering the method that the Japanese had used to lock up their date-time groups. This breakthrough allowed Station Hypo to determine not just where the Japanese would strike, but when. On May 26th, they intercepted orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports and successfully decrypted the date-time data using Finnegan's methods. The orders specified that the attack would occur on either June 4th or 5th, 1942. This level of precision was unprecedented. Admiral Nimitz would know not just where to position his forces, but when the enemy would arrive. The Washington analysts questioned whether Rochefort was being too aggressive in his interpretations, reading certainty into partial messages, letting his confidence overcome analytical caution. Admiral King remained unconvinced. The career consequences for Rochefort, if he was wrong, would be catastrophic. He would be blamed for misleading the Pacific Fleet commander, for risking America's last carriers on faulty analysis. His career would be over, and worse, American sailors would die because of his mistake. But Rochefort stood by his analysis. His team had been working 18 to 24-hour shifts for weeks, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and occasional sandwiches brought to the basement. The evidence was overwhelming. The volume of message traffic, the units involved, the logistical preparations, the date indicators, and the water ruse confirmation all pointed to the same conclusion. Midway, early June, 4 carriers. This was Japan's next major operation. By May 27th, Rochefort's team had decrypted enough messages to provide Nimitz with almost the entire Japanese order of battle. They knew the Japanese force would include 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the most experienced carrier division in the world. They knew the force would include 2 battleships, among them Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. They knew about the 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers, providing escort. They knew about approximately 250 carrier aircraft flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They knew about the invasion force carrying 5,000 troops scheduled to land on Midway on June 7th. The intelligence was so detailed that Nimitz's staff could predict the Japanese approach route, the timing of the first airstrikes, and even the composition of the attack formations. On May 27, 1942, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Rochefort and Leighton presented this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. He was crowded with staff officers, many skeptical that such detailed intelligence could be accurate. Rochefort, still in his bathrobe, walked them through the analysis, explaining how each conclusion had been reached, showing them the partially decrypted messages, demonstrating the analytical process that had yielded such specific information. No navy in history had ever possessed such complete intelligence about an enemy's operational plans before the battle began. It was a cryptanalytic achievement that would never be repeated at this scale. The combination of Station Hypo's breakthrough against JN-25, the volume of Japanese communications, and the Japanese assumption that their codes were secure had created a perfect intelligence window. Nimitz now knew things that many Japanese officers didn't know. He understood Yamamoto's strategy better than some of Yamamoto's subordinates. But intelligence alone doesn't win battles. Nimitz faced a terrible calculus. He had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were in good condition, but Yorktown was badly damaged. The carrier had been so severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea that initial assessments estimated 3 months of repairs at Puget Sound Navy Yard on the west coast. Structural damage to the flight deck, damage to the fuel system, fires that had killed dozens of crew members. Yorktown should have been out of action until late summer. Nimitz made one of the most consequential decisions of the war. He told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days to make Yorktown battle-worthy. Not fully repaired, not restored to perfect condition, but functional enough to launch and recover aircraft to fight one more battle. The repair crews thought it was impossible. They were being asked to accomplish in 72 hours what would normally take 90 days. What followed was a near miracle of industrial effort. Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1 at 11 a.m. on May 28th. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock. Welders repaired structural damage to the flight deck. Electricians restored damaged systems. Damage control teams patched holes. Some repairs were temporary expedients that would require proper fixing later, but they would hold for one more battle. The ship was still carrying some repair crew when she steamed out the morning of May 30th, heading to join Enterprise and Hornet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Against Japan's 4 fleet carriers and experienced aviators, Nimitz could field 3 carriers with less experienced pilots. The Japanese had been at war since 1937. Their naval aviators had hundreds of hours of combat experience in China and across the Pacific. They had trained together for years, developing sophisticated tactics. Their aircraft carriers had operated together as a strike force since the beginning of the war, achieving perfect coordination. American carrier doctrine was still evolving. Many American pilots had never seen combat. Some had only basic training in carrier operations. The disparity in experience was enormous. The numbers were daunting in every category. But Nimitz had the ultimate advantage that Rochefort had given him: perfect intelligence. He positioned his carriers at a location they nicknamed Point Luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese carriers after the first strike on Midway's airfields. The Japanese, confident that they had achieved surprise, expected to attack the undefended island, recover their aircraft, rearm them with different weapons, and then hunt for American carriers they assumed were still at Pearl Harbor, or at least several days away from the battle area. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, believed he would have hours to conduct operations before encountering any American opposition. He expected to bomb Midway into submission, then spend the afternoon searching for American ships, if any were nearby. The possibility that 3 American carriers were already positioned northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush, never occurred to him. Japanese naval intelligence had assured him that Yorktown was sunk at Coral Sea, that Enterprise and Hornet were thousands of miles away, and that no American carriers could possibly be near Midway when his forces arrived. Nimitz's gamble was almost incomprehensible in its boldness. If Rochefort was wrong about the location, timing, or Japanese force composition, the Pacific Fleet would be destroyed, and Hawaii would be defenseless. If Washington's analysis was correct and the attack came elsewhere, Nimitz would lose both his carriers and the actual Japanese target. If the intelligence was right but the battle went badly, America would lose its last 3 carriers and the war in the Pacific would be lost. Nimitz was staking everything on the analysis of intercepted messages performed by a small group of exhausted men working in a basement with primitive equipment. On June 3, 1942, Navy patrol planes spotted the Japanese fleet approaching Midway from the northwest, exactly where Rochefort had predicted. The PBY Catalina flying boats, operating at the extreme limit of their range, found the invasion transport group first, then the carriers. Each sighting report confirmed Station Hypo's analysis: location, timing, force composition, all matching the intelligence. Nimitz's gamble was validated. The trap was set. At dawn on June 4th, 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers and headed for Midway, 36 HED-3. A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B, 5N torpedo bombers armed with high-explosive bombs for land targets, and 36 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. American radar on Midway detected them 93 miles out at 5:45 hours. The defenders scrambled every available aircraft to intercept. The Japanese strike devastated Midway's facilities, destroying fuel tanks, hangars, and the command post. American fighters tried to intercept, but were overwhelmed by the Zeros. Marine Corps pilots in obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters suffered terrible casualties. Ground fire damaged some Japanese aircraft, but the attack achieved most of its objectives. The Japanese formation commander, examining the results, radioed back that a second strike would be necessary. Midway's runways were damaged, but still operational. Defending aircraft had survived. The base wasn't completely suppressed, but the first real shock came with American aircraft from Midway attacking the Japanese carriers. Marine Corps dive bombers, Army Air Force B-17 bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers struck at the Japanese fleet without success, suffering heavy casualties. But they forced the Japanese to keep their combat air patrol engaged. They disrupted Japanese operations. They demonstrated that American forces were more capable and determined than Japanese intelligence had suggested. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a critical decision. His aircraft were returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land. The after-action assessment suggested a second strike on Midway would be necessary to completely suppress the base. Following doctrine, he ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike. Ordnance crews began removing the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from the aircraft spotted on the hangar decks, replacing them with high-explosive bombs designed for land targets. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A Japanese scout plane, launched late due to a catapult problem, reported sighting 10 American surface ships to the northeast. The scout's initial report didn't specify ship types, but the presence of any American ships in the area was unexpected. Nagumo suddenly faced the possibility of American carriers in the area, something he had been assured was impossible. Yorktown was supposedly sunk. Enterprise and Hornet were supposedly nowhere near Midway. Nagumo immediately halted the rearming process and ordered his aircraft switched back to anti-ship weapons, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The ordnance crews reversed course, removing the land attack bombs they had just loaded, bringing up anti-ship weapons from the magazines. The flight decks and hangars of all 4 Japanese carriers became scenes of controlled chaos. Bombs that had just been mounted on aircraft were removed and sent below. Torpedoes were brought up from magazines and attached to aircraft. Fuel lines remained connected to planes as they were being rearmed. Loose ordnance, both bombs and torpedoes, piled up on deck because there wasn't time to properly store everything below, while simultaneously preparing for launch. It was the most dangerous situation possible on an aircraft carrier. Fully fueled planes surrounded by loose bombs and torpedoes, with aviation gas fumes thick in the air. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers arrived overhead. 3 squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had become separated from their fighters and torpedo bombers during the flight to the target, but they had found the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had extended his search beyond the expected intercept point, gambling his fuel reserves on finding the Japanese. His decision paid off when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the carrier force. The Japanese carriers were attempting to launch their strike against the American fleet. Their decks were crowded with fully armed and fueled aircraft. Their combat air patrol fighters were at sea level, having just finished destroying the last of the American torpedo bomber attacks. The Devastator torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers had attacked with suicidal courage, knowing their slow aircraft stood little chance against Zeros. 41 torpedo bombers attacked, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit, but their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupted Japanese defensive coordination. The dauntless pilots pushed over into their dives from 14,000 feet, screaming down at speeds approaching 250 knots. In approximately 6 minutes of perfectly coordinated attacks, they destroyed 3 Japanese carriers. The timing was so precise, the attack so well executed, that to Japanese observers it seemed like a single overwhelming assault. The Akagi took a bomb through the flight deck that detonated in the hangar bay among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Fires spread instantly through aviation fuel spilled on the hangar deck. Within minutes, Akagi was burning out of control. Admiral Nagumo and his staff had to abandon the flagship. The Kaga suffered 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. The forward elevator was blown out of its shaft. The bridge structure was wrecked. Fires engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Ammunition and fuel explosions continued for hours. Kaga's captain ordered abandon ship but stayed aboard himself, going down with his command. The Soryu took 3 direct hits. All 3 struck within seconds of each other, devastating the ship. The flight deck ruptured. The hangar became an inferno. Soryu's crew fought to save their ship, but the damage was catastrophic. After 20 minutes of firefighting, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. He remained aboard. Soryu sank 7 hours later, taking 711 men with her. All 3 carriers were doomed within minutes, their crews abandoning ship as uncontrollable fires consumed the vessels. Japanese damage control procedures, which emphasized firefighting over flooding control, couldn't cope with the scale of the damage and the fuel fires. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had become separated from the others earlier in the day and escaped the initial attack. She launched strikes that badly damaged Yorktown, hitting the American carrier with bombs and torpedoes that brought her to a halt. But American dive bombers found Hiryu later that afternoon and left her burning like her sister ships. By evening on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or abandoned. Japan lost 3,507 men, including many of her most experienced pilots and maintenance crews. Among the dead were some of the most skilled aviators in the world, men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, destroyed the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Their loss would prove impossible to replace. The United States lost Yorktown, which succumbed to submarine torpedoes 2 days later while under tow. The Japanese submarine I-168 found the carrier on June 6th and put 2 torpedoes into her hull. A 3rd torpedo sank the destroyer Hammond alongside Yorktown. The carrier rolled over and sank on June 7th. American casualties totaled 362 men. In approximately 6 minutes of perfectly executed dive bombing, the war in the Pacific had changed. The transformation was total and irreversible. Japan had begun the war with overwhelming carrier strength. After Midway, she had lost 4 of her 6 fleet carriers and could not replace them. Japanese shipyards could not match American production capacity. The United States was about to commission dozens of new carriers from its enormous industrial base. The Essex-class carriers were already under construction, each one larger and more capable than the carriers lost at Midway. Japan would never again conduct offensive operations. Every subsequent battle would be defensive, attempting to hold what she had already captured. The mathematics of American industrial power would grind Japan down slowly but inevitably. The transformation that Rochefort's intelligence had made possible would shape the entire Pacific War, and it had all begun with 5-digit number groups on punch cards in a basement in Hawaii. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The timing of the dive bomber attack, arriving just as the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, was partly luck, but also partly the result of understanding the enemy's operational procedures well enough to predict when they would be rearming aircraft. None of that would have been possible without the breakthrough against JN-25 and the brutal analytical work that allowed Rochefort's team to read Japanese intentions. But recognition for this achievement would prove elusive and politically fraught. The bureaucratic warfare between Station Hypo and OP-20G in Washington intensified after Midway rather than resolving. Both organizations claimed credit for the victory. Washington argued that their analysis had contributed to the success. Station Hypo insisted their work had been decisive. The dispute became personal and bitter. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, resented Rochefort's independence and his direct relationship with Nimitz. Redman's brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, held a senior position in naval communications and supported his brother's efforts to centralize control of cryptanalysis in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, supported the Redman brothers. King believed in centralized command and distrusted Rochefort's informal methods. In October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo and reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The official reason was that he needed sea duty for career advancement. Everyone understood it as punishment for insubordination. Rochefort had been right about Midway. His analysis had enabled the greatest American naval victory of the war. But he had bypassed the chain of command, antagonized powerful officers in Washington, and made enemies of the Redman brothers. Admiral Nimitz was reportedly enraged but couldn't prevent the removal. King commanded the entire Navy. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet. In a dispute between fleet commanders and the Chief of Naval Operations, CNO-1, Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after Midway, citing his sustained superior performance and noting that his work contributed in large measure to the victory. King's office denied the award. Rochefort would never return to cryptanalysis. He commanded the floating dry dock, a backwater assignment for an officer of his capabilities. Later, he was assigned to administrative duties at Pacific Fleet headquarters. He never received the sea command he wanted. He never advanced beyond the rank of captain. When he retired in 1953, it was without the recognition his Midway achievement deserved. The denial of recognition was a grave injustice that would take decades to correct. But the work continued. Throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943, Station Hypo continued reading Japanese naval communications, though under new leadership. The intelligence supported the Guadalcanal campaign, where American and Japanese forces fought a brutal 6-month battle for control of a strategic island. Intelligence from decrypted messages helped position American ships for naval engagements, warned of Japanese reinforcement convoys, and provided strategic warning of Japanese intentions. The intelligence supported the island-hopping strategy across the Central Pacific as American forces bypassed strong Japanese garrisons and seized less defended islands, cutting Japanese supply lines and moving ever closer to Japan. Each operation benefited from signals intelligence that revealed Japanese dispositions, identified weak points, and warned of counterattacks. Station Hypo's work eventually contributed to Operation Vengeance in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted and shot down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft based on decrypted flight plans. Yamamoto was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect frontline units. Station Hypo intercepted and decrypted messages containing his complete itinerary, including departure time, route, and arrival time. The intelligence went up the chain to President Roosevelt, who authorized the mission. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flew from Guadalcanal, intercepted Yamamoto's transport exactly on schedule, and shot it down. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, died in the jungle of Bougainville. His loss was a devastating blow to Japanese morale. Thomas Dyer remained at Station Hypo throughout the war, rising to captain. His work on JN-25 and his supervision of the critical breakthroughs that enabled Midway would make him known within cryptologic circles as the father of machine cryptanalysis. After the war, he became one of the 3 primary cryptanalytic trainers for both the Armed Forces Security Agency and later the National Security Agency, along with William Friedman and Lambros Kalimahos. His techniques for using IBM machines in cryptanalysis influenced a generation of signals intelligence professionals. Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, who had championed Rochefort's analysis and presented it to Nimitz, served throughout the Pacific War and retired as a rear admiral. He spent decades after the war working to get recognition for Rochefort's contributions. His memoir, And I Was There, published in 1985, provided detailed documentation of Rochefort's achievements and the injustice of his treatment. Layton never stopped advocating for his friend. Joseph Finnegan, who discovered how to decrypt the Japanese date-time groups, continued his cryptanalytic career and became a leading figure in post-war signals intelligence. His breakthrough had been crucial to determining the attack date, allowing Nimitz to position forces with perfect timing. Without knowing the date, American carriers might have arrived too early and exhausted their fuel, or too late and missed the battle entirely. The linguists, traffic analysts, and cryptanalysts who had worked those impossible hours in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor went on to various careers. Most never spoke publicly about their wartime work due to classification restrictions that lasted for decades. The institutional memory of their achievement remained classified until the 1970s, more than 30 years after the war ended. Families didn't know what their fathers and husbands had done. Neighbors didn't understand why certain men had spent the war in Hawaii rather than fighting. The cryptanalysts carried their secrets in silence, unable to claim credit for achievements that had changed history. The true scope of American success against Japanese codes wasn't declassified until the mid-1970s, when the National Security Agency began releasing historical documents about World War II cryptanalysis. Only then could historians and the public understand how thoroughly American cryptanalysts had penetrated Japanese communications, how much intelligence had shaped major battles, and how critical the work of men like Rochefort and Dyer had been to Allied victory. In 1980, a campaign began to secure proper recognition for Rochefort's contributions. Admiral Donald Mack Showers, who had worked in naval intelligence during the war and later served at the CIA, led the effort. He was joined by Navy Secretary John Lehman, who understood both the historical importance and the injustice of Rochefort's treatment. The campaign gained momentum as classified documents became available to historians, and the full story of Station Hypo's achievements could finally be told. On May 30th, 1986, almost exactly 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rochefort posthumously. Rochefort had died on July 20th, 1976, never knowing he would finally receive the recognition he had earned but been denied. His children accepted the medal on his behalf at a White House ceremony. The citation praised his sustained superior performance and noted that his intelligence work contributed in large measure to the victory of United States forces at Midway. It was an understated description of the most important intelligence achievement in American military history. The story of how one team's code-breaking expertise changed the course of World War II and reveals profound truths about intelligence, leadership, and innovation. Rochefort succeeded because he combined multiple rare skills: mathematical ability for cryptanalysis, linguistic and cultural knowledge of Japan gained during 3 years of study in Tokyo, from 1929 to 1932, intelligence analysis, expertise, and leadership skills that fostered collaborative innovation. His willingness to bypass bureaucratic channels to get intelligence to the commander who needed it showed moral courage. His insistence on accuracy, despite pressure from Washington, demonstrated intellectual integrity. His creation of an environment where junior officers could contribute fully regardless of rank showed enlightened leadership. He understood that breaking JN-25 required every member of his team working at maximum capability, sharing insights, challenging assumptions, and synthesizing fragments into coherent intelligence. Thomas Dyer's willingness to work extended shifts, with pharmaceutical assistance showed dedication that went beyond reasonable expectations. The entire Station Hypo team demonstrated that impossible challenges could be met through collaboration, innovation, and relentless effort. They understood that what they were doing mattered more than personal comfort, sleep, or health. The men defending Midway, the pilots flying into combat, the sailors manning battle stations, all depended on the accuracy of Station Hypo's intelligence. The technical achievement was extraordinary. Breaking JN-25 required not just mathematical skill but intuition, pattern recognition, and the ability to think like the enemy. The IBM punch card machines helped with sorting and searching, but the actual breakthroughs came from human intelligence applying creativity to seemingly intractable problems. The scale of the task was overwhelming, with approximately 30,000 to 33,000 code groups in actual use. Each message presented millions of potential meanings. Finding the right interpretation required years of accumulated knowledge, brilliant guesses validated through comparison with other messages, and the synthesis of partial information into actionable intelligence. There were no computers in the modern sense, no automated analysis tools, no machine learning algorithms, just pencils, paper, punch cards, and human minds working at the absolute limits of their capabilities. The cryptanalysts worked with the knowledge that every hour counted, that the next message might contain intelligence that could save thousands of lives. The strategic impact extended far beyond Midway. Rochefort's work established that signals intelligence could provide decisive advantage in modern warfare. It demonstrated that investing in cryptanalysis, even when the work seemed impossibly difficult, could yield results that changed the course of history. It showed military commanders that trusting intelligence analysts and acting on their assessments, even when those assessments contradicted conventional wisdom, could lead to victories that would otherwise be impossible. The transformation of the Pacific War that began at Midway created ripple effects that would shape the world for decades. Japan's defeat led to American occupation and the transformation of Japan into a democratic ally. The Pacific Island chains would become key positions in the Cold War. The carrier aviation tactics developed during the Pacific War would dominate naval warfare for the next 8 decades. The cryptanalysis techniques pioneered at Station Hypo would evolve into the massive signals intelligence infrastructure of the National Security Agency. The lessons learned from breaking JN-25 influenced American approaches to signals intelligence throughout the Cold War and beyond. The integration of cryptanalysis, traffic analysis, and operational intelligence became standard practice. The use of IBM machines and later computers for cryptanalysis revolutionized the field. The understanding that signals intelligence required not just technical skill, but cultural knowledge and operational expertise shaped how intelligence agencies recruited and trained personnel. The personal cost to the codebreakers deserves recognition. These men worked in obscurity, unable to tell even their families what they did. They couldn't share their triumphs or their frustrations. When the war ended, they were forbidden from speaking publicly about their work for decades. The documents remained classified until the 1970s and 80s. By the time the story could be told, many of the participants had died. Rochefort died in 1976, just as the first books about Midway codebreaking were being published. He never received full public recognition for his achievement. The lesson of Midway is simple but profound. Knowledge is power. Understanding is victory. Intelligence, in every sense of that word, can change the world. The cryptanalysts at Station Hypo proved it, and in proving it, they helped save civilization from tyranny. The Battle of Midway was won in many places. On the flight decks of American carriers where pilots launched into combat against overwhelming odds, in the cockpits of dive bombers where young men pushed into steep dives through anti-aircraft fire, in damage control parties on Yorktown fighting to save their ship, in the command decisions made by Admiral Nimitz and his carrier commanders. But it was made possible in a basement at Pearl Harbor, where a small group of cryptanalysts, linguists, and analysts transformed the impossible into the inevitable, where 5-digit number groups became the keys to Japanese intentions, where exhausted men worked around the clock because they understood that failure meant disaster, where innovation, collaboration, and relentless determination combined to achieve what had seemed impossible. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976 in Torrance, California, at the age of 76. He died before receiving his medal, before the full story could be told, before the world would know what he and his team had accomplished. But his legacy lives on in the intelligence community he helped create, in the methods he pioneered, in the proof he provided that understanding your enemy can be the most powerful weapon of all. The codebreaker who read Japanese minds and changed history. The man in the bathrobe who worked in a basement and won the Pacific War. The officer who sacrificed his career to do what was right. The mathematician who proved that knowledge truly is power. That was Joseph Rochefort. That was Station Hypo. That was how America learned to read every Japanese message, and in doing so, learned how to win a war that had seemed unwinnable in the dark days after Pearl Harbor. The story of JN-25 and the codebreakers who conquered it stands as one of history's greatest intelligence achievements. It demonstrates that wars are won not just by force of arms, but by force of mind, that the most powerful weapons are sometimes mathematical formulas, linguistic expertise, and the will to work harder than seems humanly possible, that a small group of dedicated people in a basement can change the course of history as surely as entire armies. June 4th, 1942 changed the Pacific War, but the true transformation began earlier, in the patient work of cryptanalysts who refused to accept that Japanese codes were unbreakable, who worked extended shifts under impossible conditions, who proved that intelligence could be as decisive as aircraft carriers, who demonstrated that understanding your enemy is the first step to defeating him. They were mathematicians, linguists, sailors, marines, and officers. They were the codebreakers who gave America the intelligence that won the war in the Pacific. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.